Now, to understand functions at a better level and for you to be able to create your own functions, that's what we're going to dedicate this lecture towards, okay? So let's first start with the print function. And I want you to notice a couple of things. And these are going to be key in understanding any function that you create or utilize. You have the function name, all right, and it's highlighted by the editor because we have syntax highlighting. And then it has these open and close brackets, or parentheses rather. Okay, and in these parentheses we pass data, and that data is actually known as arguments. All right, that's a key word that I want you to keep in mind. Arguments. You pass to a function arguments or data, and the function is supposed to do things with it. When you think of a function, think of it as something that performs an action. A function does something. So this function's responsibility is to print whatever data that we pass to it. So if I pass in the word hello, this will of course print hello to the screen. So there are other functions like type, and we've seen some of them. And now to get a better insight as to what the function is internally, we can actually use something called the help function. And in the arguments to the help function, we can pass any other function's name, all right? And we don't need parentheses after the function name, that we just need to give the name of the function to the help function. And what help is going to do is going to give us what this function is all about. Okay, so let's run this and notice that it gives us the signature of the print function. And what a signature is basically a template of how that function is to be utilized. So they have the value. This is what we want printed to the screen. And then there are some other arguments that we have not looked at yet. And that is, for example, SEP is an argument. It's a kind of data. And end is another kind of argument. All right. File is another argument, and flush is an argument. All right. So these are all the different types of data that this print function is capable of accepting as arguments. All right. And then it gives us some documentation. It says prints the value to a stream, yada, yada, yada. Don't worry about those details for now, but it tells you what each of these arguments mean, what they're supposed to be used for. And these are, as you can see, optional. These are optional keyword arguments, and we'll talk about how you can create your own optional arguments. But that's really the key that I want you to keep in mind. This help is, of course, also a function that has open and close parentheses, and in there we can pass anything, right? Any other function name. Now let's create our own function. And so the syntax for that is we first type DEF, which stands for definition. We're about to define a function. And so then we give the function name. And so we can say, let's make a function called greet person. So greet underscore person. And this underscore is a naming convention that's used in Python a lot. So make sure when you have compound words like this in a given name, you separate them with an underscore. All right. And then we have the open and close parentheses. And then you put a colon. Okay. You put a colon, and then when you hit enter, automatically what's going to happen is your IDE is going to kind of move in. It's going to tab in. Notice we have all this empty space. The IDE, as soon as you press enter after the colon, it moves to 4 or 5 spaces in, or whatever you have your editor set to. By default, I believe it's 4. Let's just make sure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep. And so 4 spaces in, and here is where we actually give the instructions of what a function is supposed to do. And what are instructions? That's basically code that needs to be performed by a computer. And that's all we've been doing so far, right? We've been giving instructions to the computer to perform various things. And so we're going to give the instructions inside of this method as to what needs to be done. And so greet person should greet anyone, right? So we can just say print, and inside of here we're saying print, and what do we want to print? Well, we could say hello there. This is a greeting, like that. Okay? And then when you hit enter and you go backspace, that's it. This function now, notice there's a plus sign. You can click on it and it hides the details, the guts of that. And this is handy when you're reviewing code, but no need to hide this code because there's only it's just one line in there. But I want to show you that you can use that feature in this IDE. So this is the actual function definition. Okay, and so now I can call this greet person function. All I have to do is type in greet underscore person, and then I use the open and close parentheses. That's it. This is known as defining the function. Notice the def and the colon, and in the inside of this, we have the actual code. And this is actually known as calling the function. Just like we were calling the print function, we are now calling the greet person function. And so let's hit run, and notice it says, hello there, this is a greeting. All right. So the instructions that were programmed in the greet person function are being executed when we call the greet person function. Now, like I said, your code is going to be interpreted line by line. So it starts from the first line and then keeps going line by line, and then it does all of the operations. If I was to move this code, this calling of the function before it's actually defined, and I put it here, right here, notice immediately the editor is going to put a red curly line underneath it. And this is basically a hint that, hey, there's something wrong here. And you'll see when I hit run, notice the error. It says name greet person is not defined. Because at the point where the editor was running, when it got to here, it tried to run it and say it didn't know what greet person was. Even though we defined it down here, the editor is not smart enough to know that this is defined later with the way we have programmed it right now. All right. There's something known as object-oriented programming, and that's a way of organizing your code in classes and modules, which we'll get into later. And that gives us all the flexibility we need in terms of calling our functions wherever we like. But in this case, we cannot call this function before it's actually defined. That's illegal. You can never do that, regardless of however you structure your code. The interpreter actually needs the code first to be able to run whatever it is trying to run. So let's move this back to where it belongs. I'm going to cut that out here and paste it down here. Let me just get rid of all these extra lines. So now notice the red line is no longer there. If I run this, it's going to run perfectly fine. The error went away. Now, just like the print function, remember we passed it a value and the print function would print it. Well, I could do a similar thing with greet person. What I would need is to specify an argument name, okay? And so I can call that argument anything. And so I can call it value, for example, or val, or anything. Let's just call it gibberish, just to prove a point. Okay, the argument name is gibberish. Okay, that's what I chose to call it. And so now, when a person calls this function, now they must pass in something in the arguments. All right. If I hit run, notice it's going to get an error because it says greet person is missing one required positional argument. It expects us to pass in the value of gibberish, whatever that's going to be. Okay, and so if I pass in, for example, if I pass in a string, let's say Taz, for example, my nickname or whatever, and I hit run, now notice there's no complaint, all right, because I am passing in some value. I can pass in the number 12, no complaint, right? I can pass in floats or any other type of object into this function. It's not going to complain now because we are following the signature of whatever this function expects for it to be used as. Now, what we do with the gibberish is an entirely different story. Right now, we're not doing anything with this argument. If I was to, for example, do something, I could actually maybe make this a more personalized greeting. I can say, hello there, and then I can give the person's name. All right, so let's try that. I'm going to get rid of that greeting part and just put a plus sign and say that gibberish is going to be included in the output of the print statement. And I'm just going to add a plus sign again, and in quotes, I'm going to put the exclamation point at the end, okay? Now, whatever gets passed to the greet person function will take the place of gibberish, and then gibberish is going to be, of course, used in these instructions, and we are specifying how it is supposed to be used, all right? And so let's pass in, for example, my name, and so I can say Imtiaz, all right? That's my name, so let's hit run, and boom, notice now this time it's saying, hello there, Imtiaz, all right? So the gibberish variable, or argument rather, was utilized in this function. Now, there's something called default arguments, okay? And so I can give a default value in case if someone decides to call this function without giving any data, without giving any argument into this, this function would still run. And I can say that by default, gibberish should equal your name. And so by default, if someone does not pass in a name to this greet person function, it's going to assign the text right here, which is called your name. It's going to assign that text to gibberish, and that's going to, of course, be used as it normally is. And so let's hit run, and notice this time it's saying, hello there, your name, okay? Or I can change this to buddy so that it doesn't look awkward. So let's hit run now, and it's saying, hello there, buddy. But if I pass in a name such as Imtiaz, my name, it's not going to consider buddy. This is the default value. It's actually going to override that value with the data that I passed in. And so let's hit run, and now this time notice it says, hello there, Imtiaz. So oftentimes it's a good idea to give your arguments default values like this, so that when someone is calling that function, obviously it needs to make sense. If you give a default value that breaks your code or doesn't, that would obviously be bad, right? So you've seen that you can't concatenate strings with numbers before. We went over that earlier when we were talking about data types. So if I give a default value of, for example, the number 4, right? If I run this code, it's not going to cause any issue because we are passing in the word Imtiaz. This is text, and string data could be concatenated with string data. So let's hit run, and notice it says, hello there, Imtiaz. There was no problem. But the minute I get rid of this and leave it empty, now the default value is going to take over. And so what's going to happen when we try to concatenate a string with an integer like this, it's going to throw an error. Let's hit run, and boom, there you go. Notice it says type error. Can only concatenate string, not int. Okay? So what we would have to do is, of course, turn this into a string by wrapping it with quotes, or I kind of briefly hinted to you this other function much earlier on called the str function. I don't know if you remember, but if you do str around any integer, it turns that integer into a string. And so let's hit run, and notice now it's actually printing 4 because we are invoking the str function on it. And so this gets first executed. Remember, when we're calling this, the entire statement does not get run first. It works from the inside out, right? So this gets evaluated first. It converts the 4 into a string, and then the concatenation takes place. All right, so just a couple of things to keep in mind. I'm just going to leave this str in here just in case because, well, we'll give a default value of buddy, and so that if someone was to pass in the number 100, we don't want this code to break. All right, it's going to sort of handle it in a more graceful manner. It's going to convert that 100 to a string using the string function. And let's run this, and notice it's saying hello there 100. Now another thing that's also very important is you should be documenting your functions in a production grade application. Right now we're not going to do any documentation because we are learning this, but basically leave comments in the code so that other people can read and understand what's going on. And when you define a function like this, inside of that function you better have some kind of documentation. All right, especially in a production grade application. So the way that works is inside of the function body. Now this is known as the function body, okay? And it only has a one-line body. But if I was to add some other stuff such as print hey there, and then add some other lines, this is all the body of the function. All of these instructions are part of this function. Okay, as long as they are spaced like this, you want to make sure. Okay, so this is the body of the function. When you run it, of course, it's going to run all of the commands that are in that function, and it's going to print to the screen whatever it is, whatever those instructions are saying. But along with these types of code instructions, you want to provide comments to whoever is going to be using that function, to the person, the programmer. And so the way we could do that is we put 3 quotes like this, either 3 single quotes or 3 double quotes. And inside of here, we can provide some information about, what this function is. And so that's typically, doc string, and we can say information or anything. You could actually, I'm going to define this and say that this returns a greeting. And then we can say that the input is actually the variable gibberish. That's the argument name. Now this is actually referred to as a parameter. Okay, in the function definition, this is the definition of the function. We're specifying that the parameter is this. But when you actually pass in the data, this is known as an argument. Okay, so just a distinction in terms of the vocabulary and how to refer to these. When you're calling a function, the data, when you pass it, that's what is known as the argument. You're passing an argument to the function. But when you're defining a function, you specify that this is the parameter, okay? And this parameter gets this data. This is the default if you choose to have a default value. So when someone asks, what is the parameter name for greet person, we can say that the parameter name is called gibberish. And so gibberish is the input, and then we can say output is, hello name or something, right? It doesn't really matter. You could just do something like that. And this gives a general sense to someone that is going to use this function, an idea of, how they can use it. We're specifying that it accepts an argument, which is called gibberish, and the output, you can expect to see a hello with the name or whatever. Now, obviously, if we give this code to someone, they're going to see this code and know immediately what this does, right? But what happens in a real program, and we're going to get into that when we talk about classes, we're going to be encapsulating these instructions into other modules or classes, okay? And so the programmer that would like to use your function may not see the code unless they actually, try to control-click it, and it will take them to the definition, right? Now, control-click is a good feature. On the Mac, it's called command-click. So you press the command button first, then you click on a given function name, and it actually takes you to the built-in libraries for that given function or the class where it's defined. And you can see what the body of that function contains. So the body of this greet function contains all of this code. But if we was to go to the body of this print function, let's control-click or command-click it, and it takes us to the actual class. And this belongs in builtins.py. Okay, and notice it has the different arguments, and for SEP, notice it has a default value. For end, it has a default value. For file, it has a default value. So regardless of whether or not you pass in arguments to the function when you call it, these parameters have already been given default values. And so that's why it's mentioned that they're optional arguments here, okay? And notice the documentation here, it's using 3 double quotes. You can either use 3 double quotes or 3 single quotes to write out the documentation for a given function, all right? And there's a lot of other stuff in here. No need to go into the details just yet, but let's scroll to the top and see that this is in a module. Notice there's some comments. It's in a module called built-ins, all right? And we'll talk about what modules and classes are and so on later. So let's close out of this. And so now what I'd like you to do is to define your own function. Create your own function and call it remainder. And that function is supposed to return the remainder of dividing 2 values. So let's say we give the value 10 and we give the value 3. Well, 3 goes into 10 3 times. And so what is the remainder? The remainder is 1. So that function is supposed to return 1. Now, when you need to return a value from a function, you actually use something called a return keyword. Okay. Now, in this case, it's not returning anything. It's actually just printing to the screen. But you might be wondering, this is still returning a value, right? The difference between printing and returning is that you can capture a value that is returned into a variable or something, right? So if I was to, for example, instead of doing these print statements, if I was to just return this, all right, now what's going to happen is it's actually going to return this when this function is called. And so let's run this. If I run this method the way it is now, if I'm calling it, let's run it. Notice nothing gets printed to the screen, but it is actually returning something. And how we can tell is I can save the value that this returns into some variable. And I could say greeting. That's the variable name. And then now that I have the value saved into the greeting variable, and that value is being returned from this greet person function, I can print that value by doing print greeting or doing anything I want with this value, okay? And you're going to be creating your own functions that are going to return various values, and you're going to utilize the programming language to its maximum capacity by the end of this course. So don't worry if this is tricky at this point. But anyway, we run this function. It returns the greeting because we are using the return keyword in the definition of this function. Okay, and then we print greeting. All right, so let's hit run, and boom, there we go. This is not being printed because of the instructions in the greet person. Okay, keep that in mind. The greet person function only returns the value. The thing that's actually printing it is this command right here, the print function call. Okay, and this greet person function is being called down here, and it returns, of course, whatever it's instructed to, and that gets saved in the greeting variable, and then we can print it right here. Right, so I want you to do a similar thing. I want you to, as an assignment, to create a function, and you can give that function name remainder, and that function should have 2 arguments, and it should basically give the remainder of dividing the first argument with the second one. So for example, if 10 divided by 3, if you were to divide that, we want the remainder. And what is 10 divided by 3 is remainder? That's 1, because 3 goes into 10 3 times, so that gives us a 9, and then there's 1 remainder from 10 minus 9 is 1. And you're going to have to utilize the modulus operator that I spoke about much earlier when we were talking about arithmetic in Python. You can utilize a modulus operator to get the remainder, and I'd like your function to be able to return that remainder of dividing the first and second values. So it'll be the first value divided by the second. So try that out on your own, and then you can resume to watch my solution. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully that wasn't too difficult. I'm just going to remove this code here. We don't need to print anything to the screen from the greet person now. I want to work on the remainder function. So we can do def remainder. And as an argument to this, I'll say that the first argument is num1 and the second argument is num2. Now in this case, notice I did not give it any default value. If I wanted to give it a default value, I could do an equal and then give it the number 12 or whatever. But I'm not giving it any default value. I just want the parameter names to be num1 and num2. Now after that we need a colon, and now we actually enter the method body. And notice it's 4 spaces in, or you can type tab and it'll take us 4 spaces in. And when you're in this level here, this is where all of the code instructions would be of that given method. So let's do num1 modulus num2, and we can say that this gets assigned to result like that, and then we can return the result. Okay, and so now I can utilize this function by calling it, and we can say remainder and pass in 10 as the first value and 3 as the second, and this will return the remainder. So we can say remainder value. This is the variable that's going to store the remainder that's returned from the remainder function, and then I can print remainder value like that. And so let's hit run, and notice it prints 1. Now obviously this code could be shortened, okay, because we are capturing the remainder from running this calculation, and we're saving that into a result variable, and then we're returning that result. I could just do return on this line directly. So let's just cut that out and paste it here and get rid of this line right here. And so now I'm just returning directly whatever this is going to equal, and this is still going to run exactly the same. So let's hit run, and there we go. And I can add comments to this function by either using 3 double quotes or 3 single quotes. And I could say that this the input for this is num1 and num2. And I could say that these are the numbers to divide to get a remainder with the modulus operator. It doesn't really matter. You can really put anything in there. But at least we have some documentation here. Now, I'm not going to be documenting a lot of the functions that we write in the course because that just takes too long. But this is just for the purposes of explaining to you that when you're writing a production grade application at work, you want to make sure you put comments like this so that other people that want to run your functions know exactly how they can be used and what are the different arguments that they accept and what it returns and so on. So what are the key things to keep in mind when you're defining a function? You use the def keyword and then you specify the name of the function, and here you provide any parameters that it may have, and if you want, you can provide the default value by using the equal sign for any of the parameters. And then you have the close parenthesis, and then you need a colon, and this colon marks the beginning of this function definition. And so after this colon, you press enter, and it's going to take you 4 steps in and 4 spaces in, and that's where all of your code should be, all of the code that belongs to the greetPerson function. Now, if I was to take this return statement and move it back like this, right? Notice it's complaining. Return is outside of the function, so we can't do that. We need to be inside the function. Okay. If I have for example, a print statement going on here, notice it's giving us an error. It's outside of the function definition, and so we need to move that in. All right. So all of the instructions should be inside of the function, and the way we regulate that is through tab or 4 spaces in, and all of the commands should be in that level or further in, and we'll talk about what going further into a function means in terms of spaces later. But let's get rid of that. We don't need that print line statement. And so that's the idea, okay? And when you're calling a function, you better call it after it's been defined. Obviously, I can't call the remainder function before remainder is defined, right? Programs run procedurally. It runs line by line like this, right? So I have to define it before actually calling any function.